All right, well, I guess
Eddie?
I'll kick us off. Hello, everyone. My name is Eddie Watson. I am the Associate Vice President for Quality, Advocacy, and LEAP Initiatives at AAC&U. Thank you for joining us today for this LEAP Texas webinar entitled Value Rubrics as Tools for Pedagogical Innovation. Before we get started, I want to share a little bit about my role with this webinar and some tasks for you to perform as well. Number one, if you could, as you come in, if you haven't done so already, be sure to mute your microphone. In fact, we're going to probably steer clear of broader discussion with the microphones, just that we're expecting maybe as many as 70 or so participants. So if you wouldn't mind keeping yourself muted, but what you could do is in the chat window as the presentation moves forward, and this will be a briefer presentation. It's not presentation for the entirety of an hour. But if you would, during the presentation, use the chat window to post questions. As moderator, I'll be monitoring that window and then organizing a script for the Q&A that will take place at the conclusion of the presentations here. Our speakers today are Dr. Doyle Carter, who's Professor of Kinesiology and also the QEP Director at Angelo State University. He's also a LEAP Texas Faculty Fellow. And his partner in crime in this presentation is Dr. Kate McConnell, who's Senior Director for Research and Assessment at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. So very briefly, just to kind of get started, you'll see the webinar agenda will come up in just a second on the screen for you. But to let you know a little bit about the larger LEAP States initiative, LEAP States exists really to support large-scale collaboration, transformational change, and educational alignment to really raise the quality of college learning within and across states. So the initiative works with the LEAP framework, which hopefully many of you are familiar with, which advances essential learning outcomes, high-impact practices, and assessment for general and liberal education. Through LEAP States, AAC&U offers practical assistance, encourages innovation, and provides a national voice for systems, consortia, states, and regions participating in LEAP. And certainly LEAP and LEAP Texas is a state that is highly engaged with the activities of LEAP. They provide really a national model for other states to follow. So we're thrilled that they have taken the initiative to bring forth this particular webinar on something of exceptional importance, which is indeed assessment and value. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Doyle and Kate to take you through their presentation.
Well, thank you, Eddie, and thank you, Kate, for joining me on this. I first want to express my gratitude and respect for the association, AAC&U, and all the people that I've encountered with AAC&U are just awesome. They are certainly very learning-centered, very student-centered. They've been very helpful to me, and by extension, very helpful to my institution. I first encountered LEAP as a program at the assessment conference that Texas A&M University held for years, and used that in designing a program that I'll speak further about later in the presentation. But again, thank you, AAC&U, and all member institutions, staff, and especially Kate. I've known Kate for, I guess, 2 or 3, maybe 4 years. I lose track of time, and have really enjoyed working with her on LEAP-related things, and certainly other initiatives as well. We are at least beginning this presentation focusing on the relationship between the Texas core curriculum and the associated value rubrics. We are, however, focusing on using those rubrics not just as an assessment tool, as we usually think of them as, but rather as a pedagogical tool. And so even though that's the third bullet in our agenda there, that's really the heart of what we're trying to get at in our presentation today. And then we'll go forward and look at some professional development concepts, some lessons learned and some reflection from that, and then a couple examples from Texas and some other states, and then some other, you might say, closing information that we want to make available to you. And as Eddie said, we want to close this with questions and a good kind of roundtable discussion of what's being presented today. So let's start with the Texas core objectives, which were created by our coordinating board, Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. I say created by the board. It was actually, and I believe Larry King, who is very much involved in Leap Texas here in Texas, was part of that group, developed these core objectives back in, oh, I don't know, 2011, 2012, along in there, but the new Texas core was deployed in the fall of 2014. And as you see, we have 6 core objectives here in Texas. And these are all skill-based and responsibility-based objectives. Now, we certainly don't ignore the content of the core. We obviously are still teaching humanities through history and literature and the sciences, obviously in our core. But in terms of what we assess, and therefore what we emphasize in our teaching in the core, are these critical skills: critical thinking, communication, empirical quantitative skills, teamwork, social responsibility, and personal responsibility. These were based, at least in part, certainly aligned with LEAP's essential learning outcomes. And as most of you know, there are value rubrics that are associated with those outcomes. And so as you can see on the right-hand side of this table, there are value rubrics that can be used aligned with those Texas core objectives. And it's so easy to say used to assess those core objectives, and yes, that is the case, but these rubrics are so much more than just assessment tools. And I even hesitate to use that word just, because assessment obviously is very important. It's a natural part of the teaching learning environment. So that's one of the reasons we're having this webinar, is to help our Texas colleagues understand the value of these value rubrics as we move forward in terms of the Texas core objectives, both from a pedagogical standpoint and from an assessment standpoint as well. So advancing to the next slide, don't think there's anything there that I haven't already said, so I'll let you read that for yourself, and I'll hand it over to Kate and let her regale you with her expertise related to value rubrics.
Well, thank you, Doyle. Your description of my role, inflated though it may be, I want to start the conversation with saying something that might sound a little provocative, or at minimum disingenuous, and that is that I really have come to see the rubrics not as an accountability tool, and that's a little bit ironic, because my first encounter with the value rubrics was back in the fall of 2008, when I was still at Virginia Tech and working in an assessment role. My role there primarily dealing with beginning conversations around assessment of general education and possible reform of general education at Virginia Tech, as well as coming up with an assessment framework, including the articulation of specific student learning outcomes for the university's inaugural Quality Enhancement Plan, or QEP, with the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools reaffirmation responsibility. So it is not an exaggeration to say that initially the rubrics were a lifeline for me as a professional and for Virginia Tech from an accountability perspective. That being said, my working with the rubrics, which immediately working with the value rubrics, implicates pedagogical questions and implicates the need for very close collaboration with faculty colleagues at your institution. And as anyone who goes to an assessment conference knows, the programs are full of sessions promising answers to the faculty buy-in question when it comes to assessment. Framing rubrics as an accountability tool or an assessment tool, a measurement tool in isolation from a teaching and learning conversation can be a very limiting way of starting the conversation. It can actually start you down the wrong path in terms of looking to find meaningful faculty partners and faculty engagement in the assessment of student learning process. So through the work, what I have really come to see, and I think we have enough evidence now to justify the assertion that I make and have made for a number of years, is that the rubrics themselves are actually a pedagogical innovation with assessment potential. And what I mean by that is that rubrics for many people are certainly not new. And there are many disciplines that have been using rubrics within their class as an instructional tool or strategy with their students to delineate expectations. There are fabulous books written about, the book by Levy and Stevens about how to craft a rubric, why you would bother, what it does for student learning. And so really, in that individual conversation of expectation and feedback with students, the rubrics have been around forever, and certainly AAC&U did not invent them. But as you talk about using rubrics in a way that can allow you to gather data, that can raise up information to a different unit of analysis, so it's not just that one-on-one conversation with a student about their grade, but it's actually looking at patterns of student learning within an individual course, across courses within a program, be it an academic major, general education, or even at the institutional level. Taking the angle of grounding this within the pedagogical expertise and passion of your faculty is really important. And ironically, as I said, it's not an assessment tool, but it's important from a quality of output perspective when it comes to your assessment process. So Doyle, if you'll go to the next slide for me. When I have seen what I would refer to as good assessment intentions gone awry with rubrics, it tends to be, when I've had faculty push back and say, oh, we tried a rubric 5 years ago and we exhausted ourselves writing one and we spent multiple semesters, we did the inter-rater reliability piece, but it still seems to just not work for us. And often when they're talking about it, they're referencing pieces of that they perceive to be methodological challenges. But in reality, when you unpack a lot of those, the challenges are not, they're either not methodological in nature or they're not just methodological, but it really has to do with how these things are working in sync or not with one another from a pedagogical perspective. So, my colleague, Peter Doolittle, who ran the Center for Teaching and Learning at Virginia Tech for a long time and was my co-conspirator in doing a lot of faculty work around rubrics when I was at Virginia Tech, the way that we started thinking about it is really that what we're talking about here is that issue of alignment. So if you're thinking about using rubrics, it's almost the holy grail of alignment. And it used to be that we would try to just say, okay, if as Doyle showed at the beginning, the alignment between the Texas core objectives as well as the outcomes and rubrics that AAC&U offers, we'd say, well, if we have an outcome of critical thinking and then, at the end we have the rubric for critical thinking, we've aligned things. But as anyone who's taught a course knows, there are so much complexity in the multiple multiple moving parts of that learning environment that what we're really talking about, if you are doing course embedded assessment of any kind, but particularly with a rubric, you're really having to work on making sure that the classroom experience aligns pedagogically across the board, from the articulated course outcomes, the course content, thinking about the learners themselves and what they're bringing into the class and what they're doing when they're there, instructional and performance contexts, as well as the strategies you're using. So, our shorthand for this is that assessment has to be related to the what, who, and the how of teaching and learning, which when you bring that back to a conversation about rubrics for assessment of student learning, and Doyle, you can push me to the next slide. Okay. The pedagogical innovation piece, to me, helps us ground the use of value rubrics in the wheelhouse of our faculty, who are in, number one, the position of primary responsibility for fostering student learning for these outcomes. And number two are the individuals who are leveraging their expertise in terms of how they're designing the course. And so if we're going to start with the premise that they're not just assessment tools, that they are a possible pedagogical innovation for faculty to engage with, there's some work from the motivation side of the house when it comes to educational research that can be really helpful in framing concrete ways of interacting with the rubrics and faculty to ensure that you are actually ensuring that this is a teaching and learning tool with assessment potential, that you're not just trying to superimpose an assessment tool on faculty in a way that is not aligned or matching with what they're doing in the course. So there's a wonderful article that I just want to point people to, and it's a framework that we are citing and using in some of our work in terms of distilling our research around faculty engagement with the rubrics, that leverages the expectancy value theory of academic motivation. And it's a pretty straightforward theory. It's been around since the 70s. There is an article that talks about specifically faculty attitudes towards general education assessment. You can find it in the Research and Practice and Assessment Journal that the Virginia Assessment Group puts out. But just to give a quick, back of the envelope description, what you're talking about here are kind of a three-component approach to understanding what would motivate someone to engage in the work of the rubric. So the notion that there's a sense of expectancy on the part of the faculty members in their own self-assessment of their ability to accomplish the task that you've presented them with. The notion that, for example, a faculty member who is new to the assessment conversation would be handed a value rubric for, say, critical thinking, and be able to accurately say, okay, I know what to do with this, or I think I know what to do with this. How do I work this into my teaching and learning, etc. Coupled with that notion of meeting the faculty where they are and understanding their familiarity and comfort with the rubric, is that notion of value. What's the perceived importance that the faculty attach to using a rubric as part of their teaching, learning, and assessment strategies? And then the third kind of leg of this stool is that notion of cost. Okay, what's the sacrifice? What am I going to have to do? What's the cost in terms of time, in effort, in the learning curve? Is the value of what the rubric brings to the table high enough that I'm willing to sacrifice aspects of my time, make changes to my strategies, etc., in order to fully leverage this tool? So this is a great article. I make this reference so folks can take a look at it. It aligns nicely with an article from a couple of years earlier in 2012 that I have been using a ton in my framing of these conversations around faculty and faculty working with the value rubrics as a part of their pedagogy. So there's an article from some authors, Furco and Moley, and the reference is on the next slide. Doyle, if you don't mind bouncing over there for me. And it took the angle, they certainly didn't refer to assessment as a pedagogical innovation. And frankly, this is an article that's not about assessment, which may also be helpful to some of you. What it was an article about how to build faculty support for embedding high impact practices, one very specifically learning communities with a service learning component, into what people were doing within their courses. So you'll see that reference down below. What I was most interested in, not that this wasn't an excellent article for that very purpose, talking about learning communities and service learning within courses, I was most interested in their distillation of what it takes to cultivate faculty support for what could be major changes in a teaching and learning environment or a faculty member's chosen approach to teaching. And what this article did was really distill it and drive it down. They looked at things like faculty adoption of information technology, technology diffusion. They looked at organizational theory literature and drilled it into something that I found very useful and actionable in terms of how I conceptualized talking to faculty about the value rubrics, as well as working to create faculty development opportunities and engagement opportunities with the rubrics. So the 4 conditions I have on the next slide, and I'll be honest with you, they do not, for lack of a better phrase, sound like rocket science, but these are really good tenets and reminders that I've literally had for years just posted on my bulletin board in my office at Virginia Tech because it kept me honest. I will tell you that it is more expedient sometimes if you are the assessment professional responsible for answering calls from accountability masters, whomever they may be, the state, regional accreditors, what have you. It may feel more expedient sometimes to say, well, I'm just going to send this to you, just do this, just fill it out, you know, and get me some data. And I certainly understand the temptation or the frustration when things aren't moving as quickly as you want them to sometimes. But these conditions reminded me very clearly on a daily basis how I could actionably frame assessment as something other than a hammer faculty were not interested in engaging with. And they're right there for you to read, but the first, just that the goals of the innovation must be clearly communicated and consistent with faculty values and concerns, that faculty have the opportunity to gain expertise with the innovation and explore their questions in a way that does not make inordinate demands on their time, going back to that cost piece of the expectancy value motivation theory, that faculty should see rewards for their participation, and then finally that faculty must perceive an institutional commitment to providing ongoing support for the innovation. So for example, just quickly with number 1, you know, that notion that things need to be clearly communicated is not enough. It has to be a communication that is consistent with faculty values and their concerns. So that, you know, to me, the simplest takeaway from that is it's not enough to say use this rubric because SACS is coming, but it's really about engaging faculty in a conversation with the rubric that gets at what they care about most, the teaching in their classrooms and the learning that their students experience when they help to foster. The rubrics themselves, I believe, actually provide faculty with faculty development. So just engaging and reading and talking through the value rubrics. We have data that supports faculty perceptions that, you know, just even going through the process of reading this and considering it in light of my own teaching or in terms of how I'm framing my class has made me rethink how I'm doing certain things with a particular assignment design or how I frame this on my syllabus. And those sound like small changes, and they may be, but they all are the building blocks that go towards what we hope is fostering a culture of teaching, learning, and assessment on a campus. Number 3, the notion that faculty should see rewards for their participation. Certainly, in my fantasy world, the uber reward of doing assessment work is that it counts towards you know, part of your teaching and or research, depending on the culture and context of your institution. When it comes to P&T conversations, there's some excellent examples of that. But it doesn't always have to be that huge reward. It can be certainly some intrinsic rewards, but then also just smaller rewards that an assessment office might actually have at their disposal. For example, small travel grants to help present on the work, or grants that can help support getting a piece of technology or a student work study when there's a more expansive project that they want to undertake with the assessment. You know, so that's an example of rewards. And then finally, that notion of an institutional commitment to providing ongoing support for the innovation. I will be honest and say that the value rubrics can be a heavy lift because you're talking course embedded assessment. So there's an uptick at the beginning of investment, engaging faculty in it philosophically first, and then pedagogically and methodologically. And if the campus is only committed to doing the assessment until the accreditor, you know, the visit has come and gone and we've written our report, you know, it's certainly going to demotivate faculty's engagement with the value rubrics. So So the next couple of slides, just quickly, I'll provide some feedback that we've received from our national project with the value work. As many of you may know, AAC&U has worked over the past 3 years with the Multi-State Collaborative, our largest initiative, but then 2 smaller initiatives involving both public and privates, the Minnesota Collaborative and the Great Lakes Colleges Association, where institutions sampled 100 pieces of student work per outcome, submitted them for scoring by trained certified value scorers from other campuses, 2-year, 4-year, public, private, and really looked at this as kind of an external validation of many of the local assessment efforts they were doing back home on their own campus, having a chance to interact with people from institutions other than their own who had engaged in this work, some really rich conversations taking place around assignment design and use of data, and in particular professional development for faculty using the rubrics. And what we found when we surveyed those individuals who actually participated as scorers during the summer of 2017, they self-identified just interacting with the rubrics themselves as a professional development experience. So on the next slide, you'll see a quote attesting to that from some of our survey work, that by virtue of scoring papers from many disciplines as well as my own, I can now see how to work more closely with getting my students to further assist in getting back the work that I expect from them. One of the aha moments that seems to come through from a pedagogical perspective for faculty when they get results back, whether they're doing local campus scoring or participating in the broader national scoring, is not, oh my goodness, these low scores mean that my students don't know what they're talking about, but instead, what is very heartening and also not surprising when you think of how dedicated faculty are to the teaching for their own students, is they stop and say, oh my goodness, my assignment didn't actually ask them to do all of these things. I thought I had articulated that explicitly, but I'm going to go back to my assignment design and my instructions to see how I can better scaffold things for my students. On the next slide, you'll see some more specific work or comments around assignment design. We were finding that, people were talking about within the scoring, it was very challenging sometimes to assess student work when faculty suspected that perhaps the assignment itself wasn't aligned as well as it could be to generate high levels of student work. Or student work that would be scored at a higher level. This first bullet about the notion of student work artifacts that are not a great fit for the quantitative literacy rubric aligns with much of the national conversation that's been taking place for years around the STEM conversations around how we might change math instruction. What do assignments need to look like? There's more broadly that comment around the assignment design piece at the end. What this has helped us do as an organization is redouble our efforts partnering with such groups as NILOA, the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment, that does some phenomenal assignment design charrette work and has great resources on their website about how to run your own design charrette where faculty come together and debrief and workshop their assignments. There's another great group that's the Transparency in Learning and Teaching in Higher Education, or TILT, out of UNLV, that talks about being more explicit and transparent with your expectations even on your syllabus. The most exciting thing to me, what this does, is this really has confirmed in my head the notion that we've moved away from talking about assessment of student learning solely as an accountability exercise, because what we're recognizing is that assignments matter, faculty matter, what happens in the classroom matter, and there are positive developmental ways of influencing that work as a result of taking a look at real, authentic student work in relation to a tool like the value rubrics. Moving forward, just 2 quick pieces of evidence on the next slide. One faculty member commented, just by participating, having a better sense of what makes good writing, debriefing with some of the faculty who participated in, for example, the written communication teams with scores. Many talked about having the opportunity to step outside their own disciplinary home and look at good writing across the span of disciplines that, from which work would be submitted, and really thinking through how this influences their own thinking about their students' writing within their context. And then lastly, what we are hearing on the next slide, Doyle, from participants, this is these quotes are kind of typical of some of of other feedback we were receiving within the survey. And I love this one from the person responsible for assessment on their campus, that scoring work using the value rubrics gave insight into assignment design that I can take to my faculty. I'll close by saying that I started in the assessment world as a professional back in the early 2000s. And if you had said to me back then that the assessment conversation would have evolved to where we were talking legitimately and powerfully about assignment design, leveraging the learning sciences and teaching and learning to promote good assessment, I don't know if I would have believed you, because we were certainly in a time of what I would call a pre-test, post-test, mindset around these things, standardized tests to the exclusion of all others. And while I am not a priori an anti-test individual, I certainly think that there are some excellent tests out there that can be used in certain contexts. What I did know is that didn't resonate with faculty colleagues. And when I was able to go to them and ask for their willingness and permission to engage in conversations about teaching and learning that, yes, had assessment implications, but I could use the value rubric as a vehicle for starting that conversation, as a place to allow faculty to react and critique language around outcomes that they said mattered greatly to them. I've yet to meet a faculty member, for example, who doesn't think that critical thinking plays a role in their classroom. It really changed the tone and tenor of the conversations that we were having, and allowed me to really address that notion of the meaningfulness of this work and present it to faculty not as a sales pitch of something they had to do so we wouldn't get in trouble with the powers that be, but instead that this is a tool that can give insights that could be used simultaneously in their own teaching immediately at that course level, as well as helping us discern patterns of learning across the undergraduate student experience in ways that we hadn't before. So with that, I'm going to stop and pass it back over to Doyle to bring us home, so to speak.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the next slide, which is of rubric that is used on our campus for our quality enhancement plan. Give you some background on the development of this rubric, and then moving forward and really focusing on how this tool has become not just that assessment tool, as we said, but a pedagogical tool. And at the risk of stealing my own thunder, from a faculty development standpoint and a faculty development event, when I bring my QEP fellows together, who also serve as the faculty jury for the direct assessment of student learning, to calibrate ourselves as raters, we glean more pedagogically out of that time together than we do from an assessment standpoint. And the lessons learned from the assessment process then gets applied to the future courses. They learn things from the assessment process that then get applied to the courses that they've been teaching that are part of our QEP in a way of enhancing that, making it better moving forward. As was mentioned earlier, one of the 6 Texas core objectives is social responsibility. There is no single value rubric that directly aligns with social responsibility. What we did to develop our rubric is we looked at the language from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board that defined social responsibility. And when you parse that definition, it really had three parts: intercultural competence, civic responsibility, and community engagement. And you can see on this rubric in the left-hand column where we see SLOs and indicators, we have three SLOs that derive from that definition. Again, SR1, social responsibility 1, is intercultural competence. SR2 is civic responsibility, and SR3, community engagement. In reviewing the value rubrics, we came to the notion, which I think has been adopted fairly consistently across the state, that there were two value rubrics that aligned with the state's definition of social responsibility. And those two value rubrics were intercultural competency and civic engagement. And so what we did in developing our rubric is kind of meld those two value rubrics into one. We did want a single page rubric. We didn't want to use two rubrics. We wanted to use a combination of those two rubrics that we could, you might say, boil down to, again, that single page. And so what you see here is for each of those three competencies, or SLOs, there are two indicators. And so, for instance, the first SLO, intercultural competence, has two indicators: SR 1.1, intercultural awareness, basically that knowledge acquisition, so to speak, and then being able to communicate appropriately, which of course is a behavior or a skill. So those are the 6 indicators of social responsibility that we use. And like any rubric, you see the developmental track. We, rather than using the language for each of those developmental levels, we went with insufficient or incomplete as level 1, emerging as 2, proficient as 3, and exemplary as 4. We do reserve the right to score a work sample as 0 if they don't even meet the insufficient or incomplete level. So there are actually 5 different levels on our value rubric, our social responsibility rubric. Our QEP, from a pedagogical standpoint, we're focusing on embedding community engagement into a course. That can be a service learning kind of project. It might be an interim or some other kind of field experience. It might be within a study abroad course. So we're using what you might call HIPs, those high impact practices, as our broad pedagogy in order to give students an opportunity to develop and then demonstrate their social responsibility. And at the end of those activities, students complete a reflection paper. Those reflection papers are, of course, assessed within each course, but they are also then used for the QEP assessment. And those of you that aren't from the southern part of the United States, that aren't part of the SACS regional accreditation area, the SACS COC, or Commission on Colleges, requires each institution to develop a quality enhancement plan that is a 5-year program that enhances student learning on the campus. And so our QEP focuses on community engagement for the purpose of enhancing social responsibility for our students. Those students, again, create a reflection paper for the program level assessment, and of course the course embedded assessment that takes place as well. From a faculty development standpoint, as I mentioned, the most of the aha moments take place when we come together and do our calibration sessions. We rate a random and representative sample of all of those artifacts each semester to use for our program level assessment. And getting together, sitting around tables and rating artifacts, and then talking about how we came up with those ratings to make sure that we are on the same page in terms of what a student work needs to look like in order to garner a 4 rating or a 3 rating or whatever. Going through that process is extremely beneficial to our faculty. Being able to see what's going on in other disciplines and how other disciplines are addressing social responsibility in their courses, those lessons get used by faculty again across all of those disciplines. Kate earlier mentioned the concept of scaffolding. One of the things that we've learned is if you expect students to write good reflection papers, then you probably need them to do some reflection throughout the semester. And so using my QEP course as an example, my students have to write a proposal, they have to do a midterm progress report, and then they write their reflection paper. And each of those 3 assignments builds on the others. And so, for instance, in the proposal, they tell me what they're going to do and what they expect to accomplish. Then, of course, they revisit those 2 prompts as they continue to write their reflection, and of course, it just builds on it. And then hopefully by the end, their reflections are much, much better. I will say that within the course, when it comes to course embedded assessment, I not only assess their competencies relative to social responsibility, I also assess their written communication competencies. And so the rubric that I actually use to rate those assignments is a combination of social responsibility and writing. But at the program level, our QEP, we're only looking at those through the lens of social responsibility. But I will say that in many cases, students who don't have strong writing skills are not able to express what they've learned as well as students who do have those good writing skills. The other key lesson learned from a faculty development standpoint is the reflective prompts. We have become much better at writing those reflective prompts through this process. It's one thing to ask the question, tell me what you learned through your experience in the community, a very open-ended, not a very specific prompt, to something that's obviously much more specific. Tell me 3 things that you learned about interacting with another culture. How did you actually tailor your communication strategies when you were doing your study abroad in Fiji? What did you do different in interacting with those students, or whatever the case may be? So writing reflective prompts to me is very similar to writing good test questions. If you want to write a good test question, it's going to take time. When you started out as a beginning teacher, your test questions weren't nearly as good as they probably are now. And the same thing applies to the reflective prompts associated with some kind of written artifact, especially when it comes to reflection. So again, this is just an example of how something that derived from value rubric, this social responsibility rubric that derived actually from 2 value rubrics, is used here on our campus. And that to me is one of the neat things about the value rubrics. These are not intended to be adopted in toto. They are intended to be adapted to meet the individual campus needs. And we certainly probably use more license with that than was intended, but it has served us well. Like most rubrics, this has gone through 1 revision. After we used it 1 year, we saw some weaknesses and adjusted those to meet our needs. But again, the main benefit is we scaffold better, we write better prompts, we make our assignments match the expectations expressed on this rubric much, much better now than we did previously. Kate, I'll pass it back to you. Do you have other examples from other states that you might be able to verbally express at this time?
Oh, certainly. So I think that, so we have some from state efforts and then from individual institutions, particularly around that notion of general education assessment and QEP or other initiative assessment. So for example, in Virginia, these have been used, and I would say modified to varying degrees. At places like Virginia Tech, we used modified versions of the integrated learning, of the problem solving, and a bit of a hybrid between information literacy and inquiry and analysis for our first year experience. These were first year experience initiatives embedded within academic departments and disciplines for students' majors. And so there's a big academic component to them, not just a co-curricular or school orientation component. We use those there. Places like Old Dominion University have been using the value rubrics for significant assessment work within their previous QEP. They are taking off, I think, at the community college levels. In Virginia, Tidewater Community College has used the value rubrics for assessing the state required 6 core competencies that include, the usual suspects for general education: critical thinking, information literacy, written communication. The beauty of the past 3 years of working with the value project campuses is seeing not only how places have tailored the rubrics in addition to using them as written and submitting things to be assessed as written through the national project, was really hearing what they had done for faculty development based on getting the results back. There is a wonderful institution in my home state of Rhode Island, the Community College of Rhode Island. And for those of you in Texas, Rhode Island has 3 public institutions: 1 community college, 1 regional comprehensive, and 1 research one, being the littlest state that could fit in Texas a few times over. But they literally created an ad campaign for students and for faculty based on what they saw as disappointing results around the issue of sources and evidence. So if you look at the written communication and the critical thinking rubrics, you'll see a dimension of the rubrics that deal with students' ability to utilize sources and evidence to further their argument, to make their case, to support their thesis, what have you. And on both of those rubrics, they determined as an institution that they weren't quite thrilled with the results, and so had a literal marketing campaign to raise both student awareness of the need, but also faculty awareness, because there was a question as to whether or not the assignments across the board were adequately giving students the opportunities to practice and get feedback on this part of their skill development. Some other interesting models, I mentioned that NILOA has done a lot of assignment design charrettes. One of the reasons we like collaborating with NILOA is like Virginia Tech, like AAC&U, they provide a lot of resources that are meant to be train the trainer types of frameworks. So, folks would go to a NILOA charrette and then come home to their own campus and like with the value rubrics, modify the approach in ways that made sense for what they needed at their particular institution. So there's another community college example in Minnesota, in Burr Hills Community College, where they had an assignment design speed dating event, where it was kind of a quick and dirty, bring your assignment, sit for a few minutes with a colleague, share with them your assignment. They then give you some quick feedback, and then you rotate. They had assessment salons, kind of modeled on the Parisian salon of intellectuals coming together to digest and understand the results they were getting back. So I think the challenge is actually collating all of the wonderful examples that are out there. I'm going to put a plug in here. One of the things we have done, and you may have received one if you've ever downloaded our rubrics in the past, is we have sent a survey link to anyone, any email representing an individual who had downloaded the value rubrics. And what we've asked you to share with us is both your feedback on the rubrics themselves, as well as any versions of what you had done to modify them. The rubrics have now been in existence for about 10 years, so a decade of value, which we're very excited about. And we often are asked, are there plans for revising them or revisiting them to look at possible revisions? And the answer is yes. That's on our horizon. I can't give a time frame or a promise of it in terms of what that project will look like immediately. But a first step is seeing how the community broadly has revised and tweaked them, and trying to understand how changes that have been made might be more useful. And I see that we have up there for you several links and resources that you can look at. NILOA is up there as well, their assignment library. We're working with NILOA to actually tag examples of assignments that they have in their assignment library as being aligned with or pertaining to a particular value rubric moving forward. One thing to know about the NILOA assignment library is that inclusion of your assignment in the library is done through a peer-reviewed process. And your assignment is given a citation and marked as a piece of scholarly output, which I think is significant and important as part of all of these conversations. So if you have an assignment that you are thinking fires on all cylinders with some of these outcomes in terms of fostering student learning, what have you, I encourage you to take a look at their assignment library to see what other examples are there, as well as look at the process for submitting your own. I know they are always excited to solicit more assignments from the field. So.
Thank you, Kate. Want to make sure everyone knows that this webinar is being recorded, and the webinar along with this presentation will be posted on the LEAP Texas page. Refresh my memory, Kate, is it going to be posted somewhere else that you're aware? I don't know.
We can certainly try to link to it from some of our LEAP work. And I'll work with Larry on making sure we do that properly.
Sure. Also, I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next slide. I want to put in a plug for the 5th annual LEAP Texas Conference coming up soon. As you can see there, March 25th through the 27th, there in Houston. And you can go to that LEAP Texas page, leaptexas.org, and search that, or do a screenshot or whatever if you're listening right now, so that you can get to that conference page and get registered and join us there. And then lastly, I believe here are our contact infos. So if you have any questions that you don't get to today and want to quiz us about something, we'll be glad to help you all we can.
Hey, Doyle, this is Eddie again. We do have several questions that have flowed in the last few minutes. So I'll just pose one from that list to both of you and see what you have to say. So what advice do you have for assessment professionals interested in integrating this work with teaching and learning centers? So really sort of thinking beyond the accreditation requirements, especially whenever the context might be one where there is limited institutional commitment to such work. So really, the question is about assessment professionals working with teaching and learning centers. What advice or guidance do you have to make those relationships work?
Kate, you probably got some experience with just that, so go ahead.
My first answer is yes, absolutely make it happen. It can be an incredibly powerful conversation and collaboration. I think there's some very small steps you can take if you're initiating the relationship as the assessment person. One low-hanging fruit is have the Center for Teaching and Learning co-brand and or market help organize any workshop you're doing for assessment. In my experience, I could offer the exact same workshop, one under the Office of Assessment and Evaluation moniker, the other with the Center for Teaching and Learning, and I would have 4 times as many people coming within the Center for Teaching and Learning just based on who was advertising it. Number 2, I think it's having meaningful conversations with the staff or the faculty responsible for the work of the Center for Teaching and Learning to really frame assessment as part of the pedagogical process, as part of teaching and learning, as a skill that should be developed first and foremost because we care about what our students are or are not able to do within our classes, as opposed to the assessment accreditation angle of things. You know, the line I always use, and it's, you know, people who are in assessment know it does take work, but the line I always use with faculty was, if you're doing this, you know, if you're doing this from a quality of student learning perspective, like you are curious to know what your students are able to do, the accreditation report will write itself from a technical perspective, in that, having had to write several of these reports, it's much easier for me to write an accreditation response when there is something to write about, as opposed to, you know, a pro forma system that, you know, you get data back and it's disembodied and disconnected from the actual curriculum and what faculty are doing. And then just being open to critiques of how you might be framing things from your Center for Teaching and Learning colleagues. You know, there were many times that I started the conversation thinking that I was using the language of teaching and learning, but maybe was using more measurement or talking in more technical terms. And it's not that faculty colleagues can't understand that. So please, you know, I'm not insulting anyone's intelligence here. It just goes back to that value piece. It wasn't what resonated. They care that the measurement and methods piece are solid, so they're getting strong data. But that's not the starting point for the conversation. So be open to your colleagues' critiques and constructive feedback about how you might be framing things, and be willing to rethink the approach.
I'm not going to say anything that really contradicts what Kate says there. I will say that it sometimes is a who, not a what, is being said. If the conversation is carried out between faculty members, one of which may be in your teaching learning center, it will eventually work its way to assessment. You don't have to start there. And so your teaching learning center is kind of safe space for faculty. And so the program may be about something purely pedagogical, but eventually the question will be asked, probably by the participants, well, how do we assess? How do we know that our students are actually learning this? And those are golden moments that you need to take advantage of to get your point across.
And I agree wholeheartedly with Doyle, and will say that assignment design is a great way to backdoor into, to sneak in the back door of assessment conversation. So you start with the assignment, and then, as Doyle says, it naturally will come around to, well, how do we know whether it's working or not?
Well, hey, there's 3 other questions I'm going to ask. 2 of them are probably yes and no questions, so I'll just throw them out and see if there are quick answers. And maybe the first one's for Kate. Kate, are you, or are we, AAC&U, creating a repository of all the revised value rubrics we have received?
So in the sense that we're still collecting them right now, the repository is simply, you know, having them on hand to look at them. They've been submitted to us voluntarily. I could envision us creating that, but with the permission of the institutions explicitly. So that would be a slightly different, you know, we'd go back to everybody and make sure it was okay to showcase them, but I think that would be an incredible resource for folks to have. So yes, with a caveat of with permission.
Okay, this is kind of an extension of that question, a little bit more complex probably, but are there resources for institutions discussing best practices in collecting and analyzing data collected via the rubrics through institutional learning management system software products? So, you know, Blackboard, Canvas, Desire to Learn.
Oh, so that is a more complex question. I would say there's not an organized conversation around that writ large. People are using so many different systems for that purpose, but I would be happy to talk about that further if someone wanted to email me offline, because I'm not sure that I would have a really good answer this afternoon for you, but I think it's a really important question.
And finally, this is a question for the Leap Texas folks. Is it possible to email the slides to the participants, those that are here today?
Yes, that's possible. They can contact me if that's what they would like. I'll be glad to send them a copy of this presentation. It is also going to be posted on the Leap Texas website. We didn't want to post it in advance because we wanted people to join us for the webinar, but it will be up as well as a recording of the webinar.
Well, amazingly, it is exactly 3 o'clock. So this is our witching hour for this webinar. I want to thank Kate and Doyle again for the work they put into this presentation, and certainly for their honest delivery of their experiences with value and pedagogical innovation. So thank you both.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone. And one last pitch, I highly encourage you, if you're not from Texas, check out the Leap Texas website as well as their meetings, because there's a wealth of talent and innovation taking place there, and an incredible generosity to share the work.
Thanks, Kate. Well, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.